Oh, you already have. If I can have your attention, please, I want to welcome everyone to our session this morning, in which we're going to hear about the 15th annual report of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And we're delighted to have this joint meeting. We did it last year with Katrina Lantos Sweat, and we're delighted to do it this morning with Robbie George and Bill Galston, Bill from the NED board. The compatibility between the two institutions, even though they have different missions, is very, very profound, because religious freedom is an issue that fundamentally has to do with tolerance, which is a very, very core priority for the NED, and something that we're working on in countries all over the world today. I'll have a brief word to say about that. The compatibility in a way also involves the congressional origins of our institutions. Just 2-3 weeks ago, the NED presented its Democracy Service Medal to Congressman Frank Wolf, who is retiring, who is someone who really founded the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and one of the reasons we honored him was because of his commitment to religious freedom, in addition, of course, to human rights. And Frank Wolf had a lot in common with Dante Fascell, who was the congressman who really created the NED. And it shows really, with all the criticism of Congress today, that it really can do very, very creative things, and to create institutions, in the case of our two institutions, which can work on really critical problems in the world. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a board meeting here in this room in which we talked about some of the problems that are a central focus of the annual report of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I was reading last night the introduction, and it starts out with the murders in Pakistan by the Taliban of officials in the government, and also now journalists, increasingly. And a lot of the people who are being persecuted and killed are people that the NED supports. Indeed, we have a fellow here at the NED who is a cartoonist with the Express Times in Pakistan, who himself is on one of these lists to be eliminated because of pressing for greater tolerance and freedom. And so we really, I mean, the difference is that the Commission will highlight and advise U.S. policy on issues related to the religious freedom, while the NED's responsibility really is to support people on the ground who are fighting on the front lines of the struggle for greater freedom in the world. And other countries that we talked about at the board meeting were Burma, where you have the rise of extreme Buddhist nationalism, and Sri Lanka, which is a country we are increasingly concerned about because of the rise of extreme Buddhist nationalism, often directed not only against the Tamils, but also against the Muslim minority. Another reason why we're delighted to have this meeting this morning is because it gives us an opportunity to welcome Robbie George to the NED. Bill was saying before how astounded he was that this is the first time I've met Robbie George, even though we have a number of mutual friends, in addition to George Weigel, who is a member of the NED board and is playing an increasing role. He specializes on Europe for the NED board, but also Ukraine. George has always been saying we had to get together, so this is the opportunity to do that. I think everyone is familiar with Robbie George. I won't read the bio except to say that he's the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. The 15th annual report is different from previous reports in that this report assesses how U.S. policy has done over the past 15 years in defending and protecting religious freedom, and then it contains a number of recommendations. And I think that Robbie George's presentation this morning is going to focus on this assessment, 15-year assessment, and the recommendations. The way we're going to proceed is that he will make that presentation, and then Bill Galston from the NED board, who again, many of us know, he's not only the Ezra Zilka chair, holds that chair at the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program, where he's a senior fellow, but also I think, as people know, he writes a weekly column now for the Wall Street Journal. So Bill will be commenting on the report and on Professor George's presentation, and then we'll be conducting a conversation with him about religious freedom, about its relationship to democracy, about the report and how maybe the United States can do a better job in defending these values in the world, because we live at a time of rising ethnic extremism, religious extremism. There's a kind of an autocratic resurgence in the world today, and religious liberty is really one of the issues on the front lines of this attack on democracy. So it's something we're deeply concerned with. We're delighted to be co-sponsoring this event with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Robbie George.
Thank you so much, Carl. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here, and I want to say on behalf of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom how pleased we are to be able to work with what is truly our sister institution. If I can speak oxymoronically for a moment, I would even say we're fraternal twins as sisters, working in the same cause. And Carl, it's great to meet you, and I've been wanting to meet you for many years. I've admired your leadership in the cause of democracy and human rights, so it's just wonderful to have this opportunity. You mentioned the great Frank Wolf, and like so many, I'm sure, in the room, I was stung by the news that Congressman Wolf is retiring from Congress. He has been an absolutely tireless leader in the cause of democracy and human rights, admired across the political spectrum for his work. He was really the founding father of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And so it really warms my heart to know that you have honored him. You could not have chosen a worthier recipient of your recognition. And what a pleasure it is to be here with my dear old friend Bill Galston to conduct a conversation in a few minutes after these prepared remarks. When I was a very young scholar, really just starting out, before I ever met Bill, and while Bill was scarcely very far along in his own career, I encountered his book Liberal Purposes, which helped to shape my own thinking, especially about the relationship between philosophy and public policy. That book is really timeless, and I continue to recommend it to my own students. It's also the kind of work, Bill has gone on to do many other things, but it was the kind of work very important at its time that showed that modern thinking can be intelligently informed by the larger intellectual tradition going all the way back to ancient Greece, to Aristotle in particular. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be together with Bill, who's not only a friend, but someone who has had such a big influence on my own thinking. Well, since its inception more than 3 decades ago, your organization has been dedicated to the cause of global freedom. And so we salute you from across town for that. Your reputation goes back to that critical decade of the 1980s, the fateful years preceding the end of the Cold War. It extends today with initiatives like the World Movement for Democracy, where members of our own staff at USCIRF have assisted you, have had the pleasure and the honor of assisting people on your staff, providing societies the essential tools and building blocks for liberty. Last spring, you graciously hosted my friend and colleague, Katrina Lantos Sweat, when she was in the position I hold now as USCIRF's chairman, as she highlighted the findings and recommendations from our 2013 annual report. And so I'm delighted here in my final days as chairman. My term will come to an end very soon. I'm delighted to be able to do likewise regarding our 2014 report, which we issued on April 30th of this year. As with prior reports, we have highlighted a year's worth of developments on religious freedom in the countries across the globe that we are charged with monitoring. But as this is a big anniversary for us, our 15th annual report, 15th year since the founding of the Commission back in 1998, we thought we'd also add a special focus on how our nation must improve its religious freedom policy to address a rapidly changing landscape so we can work toward real progress in the future. In order to reflect these two aspects of our report, I want to begin by updating you on some developments over the past year following a brief orientation to our work at USCIRF. After that, I want to say just a few words about how we have sought to respond on behalf of religious freedom and what needs to be changed in our own country so that we can do a better job of advancing this pivotal human right. So let me begin by describing our commission. We are an independent and bipartisan U.S. government advisory body that monitors religious freedom worldwide and makes policy recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and the Congress. There are 9 of us, so along with my 8 colleagues, I serve as a commissioner in a voluntary capacity and, as you know, was the chairman this year, elected by my colleagues. Each of us has been appointed either by the White House or by the Congress. I was appointed by the Congress. My appointment came from Speaker Boehner. USCIRF also has a professional, nonpartisan staff which follows religious freedom issues daily. I want to say a word in praise of our staff. I've never met such hardworking, dedicated, and capable people. This happens to be the 3rd governmental agency or commission that I've served on, first on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and then the President's Council on Bioethics. And those staff, people on those staffs were excellent as well. But for professionalism and ability and dedication, I really find the USCIRF staff unmatched, and I do want to take this opportunity toward the very end of my chairmanship to say that publicly and to praise and thank them. It's important to understand, yes, thank them, absolutely. Now, it's important to understand, under the statute that created us, the International Religious Freedom Act, we are indeed an independent government body. We are separate and distinct from the State Department and from the Office on Religious Liberty in the State Department. Now, we expect the State Department to release its own annual religious freedom report, as it is required to do statutorily, in the coming weeks. So let me also say a word about the difference between their report and ours. Now, while neither report will cover our own country, religious freedom issues exist here in the United States, of course. They're very controversial. At the moment, we're waiting for a Supreme Court decision, which will come down Monday on a major religious liberty issue here. Our statutory mandate and the State Department's religious freedom statutory mandate does not extend to domestic issues. We stay out of them. We don't say anything about them. They are not within our legitimate purview. Their report, like our report, will assess the situation in other countries and note violations taking place in them in the hope that giving a proper priority to religious freedom concerns as part of our foreign and diplomatic policy, our own government's actions can help to shape in a positive direction the religious freedom situation abroad. Now, our own report is more specifically focused on the most serious religious freedom violators and violations. In addition, our report provides recommendations for how the U.S. government can respond to these abuses and encourage reform. In other words, we do more than merely identify problems. It's part of our task, as difficult as it is, to try to offer some solutions, or at least point the way in the direction of what might actually relieve the suffering of persecuted people, liberate prisoners of conscience, alter laws such as blasphemy laws and apostasy laws that can be used and in so many places are used as ways of oppressing people who happen in conscience to dissent from the position of the government or from the position of the majority in the culture on great questions of faith. As in prior annual reports, this year we highlighted key countries and regions in which the most serious freedom of religion violations are occurring, and we made recommendations to our government on how we think it would be best to respond to these abuses. We are not utopian dreamers. We do not think that there are policies that could be enacted today or tomorrow or any time soon, or indeed any time, that will magically solve religious freedom problems. In many, many cases, the problems are deep. They are culturally rooted. Our goal is to make progress for persecuted people, for suffering people, for prisoners of conscience, for religious communities that seek peacefully to follow the paths of their own consciences. Now, as in prior years, unfortunately, there is no shortage of places where abuses of religious freedom and related rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, regularly occur. A recent Pew report, and we place a lot of credence in Pew's work in the religious freedom area, found that 76%, 3/4 of the people of the world, live in countries under regimes where either the regime itself is perpetrating serious religious freedom violations on a more or less regular basis, or standing by, permitting mobs, thugs, terrorist organizations to commit atrocities or to oppress religious minorities more or less with impunity. That's very bleak. Before I came onto the commission, I certainly would not have guessed that the world was a place where 3/4 of humanity suffers regularly or live under regimes that perpetrate these kinds of offenses. And the dismal fact that I just pointed to raises two immediate questions. Why should we in the United States care? Here we are, behind two oceans and with governments that we can more or less get along with to our north and to our south. Why should we care about what's happening in Turkmenistan, in North Korea, in the Central African Republic? Why should we care? And then if we do care, and I certainly think we should care, and I know that you at NED think that we should care, well, what do we do about it? Is there anything we can do about it? Now, obviously, we should care because religious freedom is so central, so fundamental, indeed so foundational to our own history and sense of ourselves as a political community. Religious freedom is frequently referred to as the first freedom, and that's not simply because it's first in our Bill of Rights, though it is, and not really simply because it was so pivotal at the foundation of the Enlightenment ideas about freedom that have so richly informed the American constitutional experience. But it's also because religious freedom is so fundamental to who we are as human beings, so central to the dignity of the human being as a rational person who can think about things, who can wonder about the ultimate meanings of things, whether there's any more than merely human source of meaning and value, and how we ought to relate ourselves to that source or those sources, if indeed there are, how we can live with authenticity and integrity in light of our best judgments in conscience as to the truth about ultimate things. That is so fundamental to our humanity as rational creatures that it deserves this status of being referred to as the first freedom. But also and beyond all that stuff, as important as it is, at least to philosophers like myself, and I think to most Americans, it's also central to what we have affirmed and what so many other nations have affirmed in our international treaties and conventions, the obligations we've taken on. It's critical to the narratives of the very nations that top our foreign policy and security agenda, and it's crucial to our ultimate well-being and to the security of the world. We should care not only for humanitarian reasons, though we should certainly care for humanitarian reasons. If we care about the dignity of our fellow human beings across the globe, we should care about their right to live according to their own consciences in matters of faith. But more than that, beyond the humanitarian reasons, the great humanitarian reasons for our concern, there are what might be called practical or instrumental reasons. Research increasingly shows that nations that trample on religious freedom provide fertile ground for war and poverty, for violent religious extremism, for actions, the incubation of terrorism, the sorts of things that destabilize our world and place our own country, our own citizens, our own interests at risk. Religious freedom is not only a moral imperative, that is to say, but also a practical necessity. And that's why it really does deserve a seat, a prominent seat, at the table of our country's foreign policy. That's what the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, Frank Wolf's great achievement, one of his great achievements, was premised on. The idea that religious freedom should be a high priority value in the formation of our foreign policy and in the conduct of our foreign relations. It's not to say it's the only one. We all recognize that there are important trade considerations in devising and developing and executing foreign policy. Obviously, there are geostrategic and military considerations. But religious freedom, too, deserves a seat at the table, and not as a third class or fourth class or even second class concern, but as a first class concern, something that needs to be taken centrally into account whenever it's a real issue in nations with whom we are dealing. So there are compelling reasons for the United States to care about religious freedom abroad, but then the question is, what have we done, and then what can we do to defend this fundamental right? Well, one of USCIRF's chief responsibilities is to recommend to the State Department the nations we believe it should designate as countries of particular concern, CPCs. The CPC tool is a very critical tool coming out of the International Religious Freedom Act for marking the worst offenders against religious freedom, that is, those regimes, if I may quote the statute, that are guilty of systematic, ongoing, and egregious abuses of religious freedom. In our report, which I hope you have access to, you all do actually through the internet at our website, usurf.gov. In our report, we refer to these nations as Tier 1 nations. In this year's report, USURF recommended that the State Department redesignate the following 8 countries as CPCs. Now, I say redesignate because these are countries that have already been designated by the State Department, usually on our recommendation, have been designated as countries of particular concern. We want them to be redesignated. Burma, China, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Uzbekistan. Now let me say just a few words about some of these nations. Burma continues to allow sectarian violence and other abuses against Rohingya Muslims and ethnic minority Christians to occur with impunity despite political reforms. Now here's a case where you've got government bad behavior, but government bad behavior that is rooted in deep cultural problems. We recognize that. We know that this is a complex issue, one that is difficult to deal with, one that is going to take some time, but we need to be on the road pushing Burma in the direction of reform for the sake of relieving the oppression of the Rohingya and of Christian minorities who really do suffer severely in Burma. China continues to persecute Tibetan Buddhists, Uyghur Muslims, as well as Catholics, Protestants, and practitioners of Falun Gong, with serious violations including arrests, fines, prison sentences, closure of houses of worship, forced renunciations of faith, and torture. In Iran, despite last year's election of a purportedly moderate president, religious freedom conditions, as far as we have been able to determine, have actually worsened. So we got a reform president, we're told, but conditions actually get worse rather than better, particularly for religious minorities, especially the Baha'i and Christian converts, with Sufi and Sunni Muslims and dissenting Shia Muslims also facing detention, torture, even execution. I recently testified on behalf of the Commission on the situation in Iran for each of those minority groups, minority religious groups, before joint subcommittees in the House of Representatives chaired by Congressman Chris Smith and Congressman Ross Latinen. Congress is aware of the problems in Iran. It is under no illusions that things have gotten better, but it simply cannot be swept aside. The situation in Iran is dire, as I say, especially for these religious minorities, and most especially for the Baha'i, who seek nothing other than to practice their faith in peace, posing no threat of violence or subversion or anything of that type to the regime. The treatment of the Baha'is truly is an outrage, and the relief of that persecution, I think, should be a very, very high priority for any American administration. And in Uzbekistan, as many as 15,000 political prisoners have been jailed for the peaceful practice of Islam. Now you can see from what I've said already that the situation with religious freedom in the world among the most offending nations is not one where there's one religion that is the oppressor and another religion that is the oppressed. The victims are Baha'is, the victims are Sunni Muslims, the victims are Shia Muslims, the victims are Christians, the victims are Jews, the victims are members of other religious groups. And sometimes the perpetrators perpetrate their crimes in the name of Buddhism or in the name of Hinduism or in the name of Islam. It's a very complicated situation. And yet, the right to religious freedom is a simple, basic human right. It applies to everybody, everywhere, at all times, and with the same force. And we must stand up for any minority that is persecuted simply for its faith, practicing its faith in peace, and stand up against any persecutor, whether that persecutor is persecuting in the name of a religious belief or in the name of a secular ideology such as communism. Now, besides recommending some countries for redesignation, USURF this year also recommended that 8 states be newly designated as CPCs. Now, some of these are states that we have recommended to the State Department in the past, and our recommendations have not, or at least not yet, been accepted. But these, again, we are recommending for designation, though they are not currently CPCs. Egypt, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, Syria, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Vietnam. Vietnam has in the past been designated a CPC, was moved off the CPC list because of some genuine reforms, but then fell back after its removal from the CPC list into severe persecutions again, and therefore we have no choice but to recommend that they be redesignated as CPCs. But I want to focus now just on two of these nations, Syria and Pakistan. Our recommendation for Syria for CPC designation was for us a first-time recommendation. Clearly, Syria belongs among the world's worst religious freedom violators due to the terrible abuses committed not just by the Assad regime, although it has committed them, but by all sides in this horrible, catastrophic civil war, including extremist groups, U.S.-designated terrorist organizations, and internationally recognized opposition groups. The situation, as far as we can tell, is very bleak. It's hard to find good guys. At least it's hard to find elements in the war that are not themselves guilty of violations of the human rights and the religious rights of minority groups. As for Pakistan, at least 35 people, more than in any other nation, are on death row or are serving life sentences for violating blasphemy laws. Blasphemy laws are typically used to oppress religious minorities or to oppress those who seek to change their religion. The same is true with apostasy laws, of course. In addition to enforcing its blasphemy laws and anti-Ahmadi laws, the Ahmadi Muslims are regular victims of oppression in Pakistan. Pakistan's government fails repeatedly to punish religious extremists who commit murder or mob attacks. Violence with impunity against Christians, against Muslim minorities, against other religious minorities occur in Pakistan. The government stands by, does nothing. Our commission believes, and we say in our annual report this year, that Pakistan represents the worst situation in the world for countries that the State Department has yet to designate as CPCs. So when you look at the 8 countries that we are recommending for CPC status that have not already been designated as CPCs, the one at the top of the list, the one we think most deserving of CPC designation is Pakistan. So let me here in this place call again on the State Department to include Pakistan in the countries it designates when it releases its Religious Freedom Report. In addition to supporting designation or redesignation of the nations I've mentioned, this year's annual report also highlights, as a kind of early warning signal, governments that engage in or permit serious violations that are characterized by at least one of the elements of the, quote, systematic, ongoing, and egregious, unquote, CPC standard, that standard from the International Religious Freedom Act, originally of 1998. Now, we call these countries in the report our Tier 2 countries, and they include Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Cuba, India, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Laos, Malaysia, Russia, and Turkey. Now, let me just talk briefly about Russia. While we're not yet warranting a CPC designation, Vladimir Putin's government has continued to curtail religious freedom as part of a broader assault on human rights. Minorities such as Muslims and Jehovah's Witnesses have been particularly negatively affected, while a new blasphemy law enacted last year further curtails freedom of expression as well as freedom of religion and belief. So what I've summarized for you thus far are the religious freedom conditions prevailing in various countries and our recommendations for them in terms of Tier 1 and Tier 2 status. In looking at these two lists, we see something that is particularly disturbing about the 26 nations that they encompass. The total population of these nations easily exceeds 4 billion people. This somber fact fits only too well with the results of that Pew study that I mentioned a few moments ago. It confirms the truth, the sad truth, that a significant majority of the world's people live in nations with governments that either perpetrate or tolerate severe religious freedom abuses of one form or another. And that suggests some points. Number one, if religious freedom truly matters to us as a country, as it should, and if religious freedom abuses are anything close to being as widespread as we believe they are, our country needs to roll up its sleeves and renew its commitment to religious freedom for all, doing what Congress tried to do in the IRFA Act, the IRFA law, which is to elevate in a serious way, a meaningful way, religious freedom as a value to be promoted in our foreign and diplomatic policy. And so for this year, in addition to spotlighting countries, our report looked back over 15 years of religious freedom policy, identifying strengths and weaknesses and suggesting where we should be heading as we look into the future. What we found was that religious freedom needs to be raised more consistently at the highest levels of government, and that the United States really must rededicate itself to the cause. Let me briefly discuss this in terms of that act, the IRFA Act, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. Over the past decade and a half, our government has come up short in its efforts to implement this law. That's just a truth. We're covering here Democrat as well as Republican governments, and more should have been done and more needs to be done regardless of which party is in power. Most glaringly, we've seen the failure of both Republicans and Democrats when in power to utilize the CPC mechanism as the key foreign policy tool that it was intended to be under the Act. If religious freedom policy abroad is to become more robust and effective, this must change. Status quo is unacceptable. Now, the first and most C designations. The problem in the past, both with Republicans and Democrats, although sometimes things start well, things started well in the early years of the Bush administration. The problem is the designations are made and then they fall into the background. Annual designations are not made. A designation is made 1 year. It's not renewed in a second year, or third year, or fourth year, or fifth year. Years and years pass without the redesignation. And to quote my esteemed colleague, our vice chairman, former chairman Katrina Lantos Sweat, the CPC designations become part of the wallpaper and nobody notices. So we're calling on all administrations, the current administration and all future administrations, to commit, following the Act, to making these CPC designations annually. Moreover, they must ensure that the CPC list will expand and contract in a way that reflects actual conditions on the ground. Sometimes situations do improve, and then you need to think about removing a country from the CPC list. I mentioned the case of Vietnam earlier. Now, it's a tricky business. It's important not to remove a country prematurely. In the case of Vietnam, that actually happened. In 2004, it was designated as a CPC. It responded, progress was made, suffering and persecution were to some extent reduced. It was removed, I believe, in 2006 or 2007 from the CPC list. That was premature. It fell right back into severe persecution. But sometimes things really do improve, and a time comes for removal of a country from a CPC list. Sometimes countries that had policies that did not warrant CPC designation, perhaps they were what we would call Tier 2 countries. In those countries, the situation worsens, and then a CPC designation needs to be made. And right now, actually, this isn't happening. The tool is being ignored, and the list is not expanding and contracting to actually reflect what's happening in the worst offending nations around the world. For the past decade, the State Department has added no new countries to the CPC list, with the sole exception of Uzbekistan in 2006. Meanwhile, the religious freedom environment has measurably worsened, with a downward spiral in Pakistan and Syria, the backsliding I mentioned in Vietnam, and serious violations in Egypt. A better application of IRFA tools would involve a more dynamic and strategic use of presidential actions tailored to each situation and directly related to religious freedom violations. Of the 8 currently designated CPC nations, 6 had so-called double-hatted sanctions, hatted, H-A-T-T-E-D, double-hatted sanctions, for which the religious freedom basis has now expired, and 2 have been given indefinite waivers. That means our government is failing to hold these states specifically accountable for their religious freedom abuses. And let me also stress that CPC designation should not operate in a vacuum, but be part of a continuum of action that includes diplomatic engagement, consultations and possible designation, binding agreements negotiations, presidential actions, and/or waivers of possible sanctions for the narrowest of circumstances. And I would add that where waivers are appropriate, they should be limited, not unlimited, and they should be conditional, not unconditional. There should be a waiver for a specified period of time contingent upon actual progress improvements being made when it comes to reducing persecution and abuse or the permitting of crimes against religious minorities or individuals with impunity. Besides making better use of the IRFA law, we should also consider amending it. And this is some, I'm here moving to some recommendations we're making to the Congress simply for updating the Religious Freedom Act. We think the act in itself continues to be very good and very necessary. But times have changed, and as times change, adjustments need to be made, and there are some adjustments that I think now need to be made in light of the difference in the world between 1998 and 2014. So we're recommending that the law change so that the CPC tool can be broadened to allow the naming not only of governments, but of countries themselves where there is no effective government in control, such as in Somalia or Central African Republic. We also think the State Department should be permitted to designate transnational organizations and local groups or even local governments. In any event, non-state actors that perpetrate severe religious freedom abuses, and the kinds of sanctions that would be triggered would be things like the freezing of bank accounts or restrictions on travel for persons associated with such groups. Other recommendations on how the U.S. should promote international religious freedom more effectively include the need for the executive branch to expand its training, its programming and grant making, and public diplomacy, as well as multilateral efforts. I think we're still living, if I can just toss my professor hat on for a moment in place of my chairman's hat, I think we're still living at a time where so many people who are key players, important players, in the formation and execution of our foreign policy, were formed in a period when the secularization thesis was really widely believed. The idea that with modernization comes secularization, and with secularization, whatever issues arise, they don't have to do fundamentally with religion. That religion will become a less important factor in public affairs and in international affairs. I think it's fair to say that the facts on the ground have simply exploded that thesis, but it takes time for people to catch up with that. So lots of people who were very well trained were trained in circumstances where the secularization thesis was really widely held, widely believed, and so people weren't trained with the kind of understanding of religion and religious pluralism and religious controversies that we need to train people about. We need our foreign policy people to understand if they're to deal with the actual world in which modernization did not bring secularization everywhere. So back to my USERF hat. We also think Congress should hold more hearings. There's a role for Congress here as well as for the executive branch. Congress should hold more hearings on religious freedom. Those hearings are very valuable at getting the word out to the public and sending a message to offending foreign governments, in giving diaspora groups and religious minority groups an opportunity to present their case to the government and to the American people. We need legislation to be introduced and passed that reflects the importance of the issue. We need to support civil society and prisoners of conscience abroad. We need to encourage our members of Congress, as we have been doing, to participate in the Defending Freedoms Project, which is a collaborative effort that we have with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, whereby members of Congress adopt prisoners of conscience and become advocates on their behalf. A number of our most concerned members of Congress when it comes to religious freedom have done this. Congressman Wolf and Congressman Engel and others have adopted particular prisoners of conscience, sometimes associated with countries or parts of the world in which they have special expertise or special concern. So it might be a prisoner in Iran, it might be a prisoner in China, it might be someone may be held in Saudi Arabia, like the Ahmadi Muslims who have been detained there simply for the practice of their faith. Well, in conclusion, let me just state my firm belief that if we improve our use of the existing tools for advancing religious freedom in the statute, and we adjust things to create tools for the changing environment, we can pave the way to some positive developments for religious freedom in a number of countries. There are some countries that are going to be more amenable to change. There are going to be some that are less amenable to change. If you look at North Korea, the future looks very, very bleak. It's hard to see how you make improvements in North Korea, but it's not so hard to see how you might be able to bring some pressure to bear to make some changes in other places. If we weave this fundamental freedom more fully into the fabric of our nation's foreign policy, we can bring some real progress to those beyond our shores who yearn for freedom. Well, thank you again, Carl. Thank you for this opportunity to address you, and I look forward now to chatting with Bill. Thank you all for being here.
Well, thank you, Robbie, for gracing Ned's halls and for giving us such a comprehensive review of the state of religious freedom around the world, and also of the organization that you chair, at least for another few weeks. My job for most of the remainder of our time is to serve as a kind of cut-rate Charlie Rose, and put some questions to you, the sorts of questions that people listening to you, I think, would want to put to you. So think of me as a servant of the people here. Let me begin at the beginning, because it's my experience, having been in Washington for more than 30 years, that people get along in this town by pretending to know things that they really don't. I'm now so old that I've gotten past that. When the commission talks about religious freedom, when you talk about religious freedom, what are the components of that anyway? Because I suspect that some people, when they hear the phrase religious freedom, think about freedom of worship, for example, and that's certainly part of it, but I strongly suspect that it's broader than that. What is the concept in full?
Well, thanks, Bill. That's an excellent question, and it's the right question. It's the right place to begin. Certainly, the right to religious freedom centrally concerns the right to freedom of worship. However, I and others have been critical of the substitution of the phrase freedom of worship for the phrase religious freedom or religious liberty, and I'll tell you why. Freedom of worship is part of freedom of religion, but it's not the whole of freedom of religion. In addition to the right to pray in one's mosque or church or synagogue, it says that I'm on, okay? In addition to the right to pray in one's house of worship or temple, in addition to the right to bless the food before the meals or to say what you say to God on your knees before bedtime, in addition to that, there's the right to enter the public square, to share one's faith with others in a peaceful, non-oppressive way, to make one's case for one's faith, to bring one's religiously inspired convictions about justice and the common good into the public square, to advocate on behalf of policies, to do what Martin Luther King so famously did here in the United States with so many other religious leaders in the civil rights movement. It also includes, Bill, and must include, centrally includes the right to change one's religion. This is the real problem with apostasy laws. It's one thing for apostasy to be a crime, for want of a better term, under a canon law or a religious code of some sort, where the coercive power of the state is not put behind it to actually punish someone with imprisonment or a fine for leaving the faith. But it really is another thing where the power of the state, the coercive power of the state, is brought to bear to punish someone, in some cases, of course, with death. You all know about the Miriam Ibrahim case, this atrocious case from Sudan. It's quite another thing for the power of the state to be enlisted, to force people to stay in a faith that in conscience they no longer hold. So our conception of religious freedom at the Commission, and I believe this is faithful to the American spirit of religious freedom, it's certainly faithful to our First Amendment religious rights, is the robust right to worship, to pray, to go into the public square and share one's faith, to change one's faith in line with one's conscience, to advocate on the basis of one's religiously informed views about justice and the common good. That's what I would say the picture is when we flesh it out.
Well, you said something in response to my first question that I found very interesting and even provocative. And by the way, I understand, and the audience should understand, that Robbie will be answering some questions in his capacity as chair, but from time to time, as he did at the podium, he may break free of those constraints and answer as a professor or even as a human being, because not all. Yeah, you got the point. Readers of David Lodge novels know what I'm talking about.
I do need to be careful, though, to make sure that when I'm speaking as a human being and not as the chairman of the commission, that I make that clear. Because we are, interestingly, Bill, if I can just interrupt your question for a minute, we are not only a bipartisan group. There are 5 of us are Democratic appointees, 4 of us are Republican appointees. We're also mixed religiously. There are members of different faiths on the commission, and over the years there have been other faiths that have been represented on the commission, and we disagree about lots of things. But we do agree about some core things. We do agree about the things that you see here recommended in the report, and I think we share that robust picture of religious freedom that I just articulated.
Yeah.
Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt your question.
No, not at all. Because the subtext of the final component of religious freedom in the robust sense, this idea of absolute freedom of exit as well as entrance, I think you'd agree with me that that principle of free exit and entrance is not equally accepted by every faith around the world. How does the commission deal with that?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's not. We deal with it this way. I swore an oath, just swore it again, because I was sworn into my new term by Justice Alito the other day at the Supreme Court, to uphold and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
We are an American commission. We are a commission of the United States government. The fundamental understanding of religious freedom must be in line with that Constitution that each of us as members of the commission swore to uphold. And that conception of religious freedom does include the freedom of exit, the freedom to change one's religion, the freedom to believe or not to believe. The freedom of atheists is also part of religious freedom as we conceive it. So that's the first point. The second point I would make is that although you're right, it's true that not all faiths share equally the idea that there should be a right of exit free of governmental coercion to remain within a religion. Most states have signed on, most nation states have signed on to international covenants and agreements which embrace a broad conception of religious liberty, which does include the right to exit. Now, sometimes exceptions have been taken in vague ways that would leave a little wiggle room there for the government to bring some pressure to bear on people not to apostatize. But in those cases, what we try to do is our best to hold people to the commitments, hold nations, hold governments to the commitments that they have made in international conventions and other instruments. That's the best we can do. We realize that not everybody shares every component of this robust view of religious freedom, but we're going to try to hold people to what they have committed themselves to.
Well, that brings up the second interesting subtext or implication of your response to my question, because in the course of responding with a robust conception of religious freedom, you said that part of that is the appropriateness of people taking their faith into the public square and trying to implement their faith in the public square, and part of that implementation may include public law, right? As you and I both know, in the United States and elsewhere, there are lots of people who take elements of their religious creeds, and they're not simply content to bear witness to them in the public square. In many cases, they try to use their faith as the basis of public law. And I think we both agree that, at least within limits on which we might not agree, that that is appropriate. You can go beyond witness to advocacy. Okay, now let's take the case of a religion that genuinely believes that apostasy is wrong. That's a creedal matter. It takes that into the public square, and a public law is then created around that creedal conviction. So presumably we need some way of distinguishing between appropriate and inappropriate creedal inscriptions into public law. How do we think about that?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and it's a problem, there's no question. And the only way to think about that, I think, is philosophically. And you and I have both articulated some principles, defended some principles. We're not, as it happens, you and I aren't far apart on this issue as scholars.
Mm-hmm.
There are others who are farther from us. The late Professor John Rawls at Harvard, the great liberal political theorist, is one. There are others. But in what I might only half-jokingly call the more moderate position that you and I have taken, what we're focused on is the right of people to come into the public square, whether they're secular or religious, on equal terms, to advocate for what they believe justice and the common good requires, while respecting the rights of other people to act in line with their consciences, to the extent that their consciences are consistent with what fundamental justice, the common good require, like peace, the avoidance of violence, the avoidance of violent imposition. But there are going to be borderline cases. Take the area of modesty, for example. I think all of us would say that whether one's ultimate motives are religious or secular, it is acceptable for people to advocate for laws that prohibit public nudity. There'd be very little dissent about that. Now,
There might be an Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden
Yeah,
caucus
that's right,
that we
yeah,
don't
yeah.
know about, but
you might get some dissent in universities, but you wisely fled from that, Bill. I see. I'm still there. But most places that would be considered
Yeah, sure,
reasonable. But
yeah.
then the question is, okay, now what if the law requires women to completely cover themselves? That begins to look more like just a straight-out, it's unreasonable, straight-out religious imposition, although from the perspective of a particular faith, it might not seem unreasonable. So we just do the best we can, trying to articulate and defend philosophical principles that would distinguish a sheer religious imposition from a legitimate exercise of one's faith-based judgments to advocate justice and the common good. We all want Martin Luther King to be able to do what he did. We all want that. We don't want to shut that down for fear that if we permit Martin Luther King to do what he did, then somebody can come in and enact apostasy laws. I've actually endorsed the concept of public reason, although the version of it I endorse is not as narrow and restrictive as Professor Rawls's concept of public reason. But the basic story there is that you ought to be, in a legitimate public policy, you ought to be able to defend it intelligently to people of any faith and people of no faith. They don't have to agree with it, but at least should be intelligibly defensible to the public in general without relying on any particular points of revelation or secret knowledge that not everyone can share.
Hmm. If there are any reporters in the audience, the headline so far is intellectual leader of the conservative movement acknowledges influences of Galston and Rawls in his thinking.
That's right.
Don't anybody tell Princeton. Okay, this is what happens when you let two philosophers loose in the
that's
public
true.
square. Very, very dangerous. But
What I just said was not in my capacity as chairman.
yeah, it certainly wasn't. Let me just ask. Let me begin our descent or ascent towards the real world, depending on your view of Plato. Okay, that's the last philosophical reference, I promise. Over there on that podium, you'll see National Endowment for Democracy, quote, supporting freedom around the world. Supporting freedom around the world. FDR famously talked about the four freedoms. The Universal, Declaration of Human Rights, talks about a lot of rights, many of which you and I would both acknowledge. So let me ask again a question you mostly but not entirely answered in your remarks. What is the rationale for singling out religious freedom, giving it special institutional status in the U.S. government? I don't think there are any institutions singling out FDR's other three freedoms, for example.
Yes, that's true.
So, what's going on here? What's the point?
Well, one, we really do believe, and I think it's consistent with our own American experience to understand that religious freedom is foundational, it's fundamental. In some ways, violations of religious freedom function as the canary in the coal mine. When religious freedom comes under pressure, when religious freedom rights begin to erode, you can bet that freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the other basic civil liberties are quickly going to follow suit. There's also something, as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, although I think it was by way of a digression from my prepared remarks, there's a sense in which religious freedom goes to the very core of who we are. And this is true whether one's conclusions are theistic or non-theistic or even atheistic. It's our response to the most important questions, the most fundamental questions, the great existential questions. Is there an ultimate reality? Is there any source of meaning and value beyond what humans manufacture for themselves? So to be a free person, to be an agent, to be someone whose dignity is respected, you need to be in a position where you can act within the limits of justice, non-violently and so forth, in a way that has integrity, that has authenticity, that is true to one's interior judgments of conscience about those ultimate issues, those existential issues. And that's a pretty good reason for treating religious freedom not as unique in its status as a civil liberty, but as fundamental and foundational to all the civil liberties, to speech, to assembly, and so forth.
Well, this is an area I think where you and I have some pretty profound agreement, and I've spent some time trying to develop a robust conception of freedom of conscience, which I think would map pretty closely onto what you just said. But this is not about me. Let's
sometimes, Bill, on that point, we're careful at the Commission to refer to freedom of religion and belief. Because we don't want to send a message that this is a freedom that is for religious believers only, or should be protected only in the case of religious believers. We believe that the secularist, the unbeliever, the atheist has the same rights to judge for himself, judge for herself, what the truth is on these ultimate questions, and then try to live with authenticity and integrity in light of those best judgments. If you force somebody to practice a religion that they don't actually believe in, you've done them no good, and you've violated their dignity as a human being by interfering with
Mhm.
the capacity that they have to behave with integrity and authenticity.
Absolutely. So just, to clinch the point, given your articulated rationale for religious liberty, it would be a flat-out contradiction to deny that same freedom to people whose belief is unbelief.
Exactly right. And we have defended unbelievers just as we have defended
Mhm.
members of every faith from Anglicans to Zoroastrians at the Commission.
Now, let me get closer to the report,
Mhm.
indeed to the subtitle of the report, which is, renewing the commitment. And, you took a step farther in your prepared remarks, and I wrote down what you said. You said pretty explicitly that under administrations of both political parties, the government has fallen short in implementing the law. That was your phrase, fallen short. And you stated it as a fact, and I think most people who followed these matters would agree with your assessment of the facts. Why do you think that is? This is not a trivial matter.
Yeah. Look, you've been in government, though. You've served.
I plead guilty,
Yeah, you
yes,
served
yeah,
in the-
yes.
Well, of course, you were the greatest force for religious freedom when you did serve in the government. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is one of your great achievements. But you know that in government you have many, many, many claims on you. You have
I
many
do.
interests. You have many concerns.
Mhm.
There are many values that you need to
Mhm.
to protect. And
Indeed.
you're constantly putting out fires, and you're dealing with crises.
Mhm.
I understand how, from the point of view of those who are focused on any one particular concern, it can always look like that concern is getting short shrift because the president or the secretary of state or whatever the cabinet officer is in the particular area of your interest is deflected off into paying attention to,
Right.
to something else.
Yep.
Okay, so I get it. Now, we're in an area here where, in the foreign policy and international affairs area, where there are legitimate issues, real concerns about trade. I mean, the economy is very important. In a globalized world, trade relations with other countries are vital. They're vital to the economic well-being of the United States, to our own people, to employment, to our prosperity. I get it, and that's good. That's fine. I'm not saying that that should be given second-class status. Obviously, in a dangerous world like the one we live in, geostrategic and military concerns have to be given a high priority. I get that, too. Sometimes you cannot bring the kind of pressure on a regime in the human rights area that you would like to bring because of that regime's geostrategic significance.
Mhm.
Something that
Mhm.
you need from them that's vital to a security interest, perhaps in a bordering country, and you're reluctant to bring the pressure to bear on the human rights front just now. I get that. So if I were standing back as a political scientist and not as an advocate in the role that I am in as chairman of the commission, I could probably give you a pretty detailed story about some of the falling short, some of the times when religious freedom considerations have been given second place to trade or geostrategic concerns. But certainly in my role as an advocate and as a person who really does strongly, as you know,
Yeah,
Bill,
sure,
as a constitutional scholar, believe not only in civil liberties, but in the rule of law.
Mhm.
IRFA says what IRFA says. The Religious Freedom Act is law, and it's got to be treated as law. It's binding, it's not optional. So we have to make the recommendations for designations when the statutory requirement is met. And I believe, and will say here publicly, that every administration, be it Republican or Democrat, has to make the designations when the country in question is guilty of offenses falling within the statutory standard. At that point, if there are other considerations that legitimately warrant withholding, at least for the moment, the sanctions or other consequences of designation, then a waiver can be granted. There's a provision in IRFA for the granting of a waiver. I mentioned, I think, in my prepared remarks that there are two nations that have had these waivers. But I think it should be done by law. I think it should be done according to law. The waivers should be granted. So take Pakistan, for example. Obviously, Pakistan bill. No need to hide the ball here. Pakistan's of important geostrategic concern. We know this. We know it's very important. I say the U.S. government, the State Department should make the CPC designation and then consider the issue of under the circumstances, whether a waiver is warranted. But even there, I would say that if a waiver is to be granted, the waiver should be for a limited term and conditional, not unlimited and unconditional. How's that for candor?
Well, pretty good
Yeah.
for government work, anyway. I note for the record that the Commission has recommended CPC status for Pakistan for 13 years in a row. This is the 13th consecutive year, and it hasn't happened, which actually gets me to a broader point, which has to do not so much with the U.S. government, but with the world. If you look at the section of the report on sort of trends, are things getting better or worse? I read that pretty carefully, and it didn't really come down squarely on one side or the other. One of the lead sentences was, it's very hard to create a metric that would enable one to determine that. And that's fair enough, but in your prepared remarks, you suggested pretty clearly that over the past decade, anyway, things have gotten worse. So what's the basis of your assessment, unless I misheard you?
No, I think they have gotten.
You think they have gotten
I
worse?
think
That's
they
what
have
I thought.
gotten worse, yeah.
So what's going on?
Well, I mean, the world has, in many ways,
Gotten
gotten
worse.
more violent.
Yes,
It's gotten worse. Where often religious freedom abuses occur in the context of civil wars. What you see now in Syria, what horrifically you're seeing now in Iraq.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Bill, when you and I were students, it was common among social scientists to suppose that religious motivations for violence were mere epiphenomena, that religion wasn't really something that determined conduct, including violent conduct. It was always something else, and religion was the kind of superficial manifestation of it, or the pretext for it. There were economic factors or tribal atavisms and things like that. What I've learned on the Commission is that that's really not right. I mean, it's sometimes true that what looks at the surface like a religious dispute, or religious violence, sometimes that really is tribal, ethnic, something having to do with economic competition or something like that. But sometimes it really is just religion. People have religious differences. They very strongly believe in religion. They believe in a kind of religion that does not tolerate dissent. And that becomes the actual reason, not just a manifestation of something else, not just a pretext, the actual reason for the violence. And violent extremism in the name of religion, no question about it, in some parts of the world is on the rise. You see Islamic extremism now in places like Iraq. You see the Buddhist extremism that that I mentioned in Burma against the Rohingya, who are treated horribly, as well as Christian minorities. We're concerned about India, about the rise of religious Hindu nationalist extremism in India. Think about anti-Semitism in Europe. Now, sometimes it's not actually a religion thing. Sometimes it's not. It's something else. It's racist. It's racial. But sometimes it really is religion. The attacks on circumcision of male infants, or on slaughter of animals according to the Jewish law. People just don't like that, or they think there's something wrong with that. They think it's primitive, it's backward, it's abusive, it's itself a human rights abuse or an animal rights abuse. And so the rights of Jews as religious people are restricted because people don't like that religious practice.
Yeah, well, I note with interest that there is a pretty extensive section on Western Europe in this report. You're obviously not designating the EU as a country of particular concern. On the other hand, there have been some troubling developments there that I think, and the commission, I think, is signaling that they are well worth noting and monitoring. And, speaking as an individual, I absolutely agree with you. Speaking as a Jew, the rise of anti-ritual slaughter and anti-circumcision fervor in Western Europe, particularly in the northern tier, is something that we need to think about. Uh, pretty hard, but
Europe is an area where things are getting worse.
mhm,
Now, as you point out, it's not a tier one, it's not a tier two,
yeah,
but still, we're concerned about the restrictions on Jewish and restrictions on Muslim expression, for example,
mhm,
and the rise of anti-Semitism. Uh, and in some places, it is really getting very, very bad. If you look at public opinion polling, uh, you see anti-Jewish attitudes on the rise. In some countries, even the majority of people telling pollsters things that reveal that they actually do have hostility toward Jews and Judaism. People leaving France, Jews leaving France, because
yeah,
they believe it's no longer safe
mhm,
to be religiously Jewish in France. Yes, if you're secular, you just fit in and nobody pays any attention. But to be religiously Jewish in France is an issue again. This is troubling, Phil. This is going in the wrong direction.
yep. Um, well, we're getting close to the end of our time, so I just have a few more questions I'd like to put to you, all of which pivot off remarks that you have made, and which are certainly two of which anyway are clearly in the report. I would say, and I think based on what you've said, you would agree with me, that one of the biggest changes in the religious freedom sphere is the rise of both non-state actors and also civil wars or civil strife within polities that implicate religious freedom. And stepping back, doing a 15-year assessment, it seems to me that the model or the mindset that guided the law in the first place was the phenomenon of state oppression. Organized states, not failed states, not civil wars, not non-state actors, but organized states oppressing, coercing, imprisoning, killing people on the basis of their religious beliefs or absence of same, or religious
That's correct. We had in mind states like China.
Right.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the developments in the biggest news out of the past 15 years is two new and perhaps equally virulent kinds of threat to religious freedom, namely civil war non-state actors. So, stepping back and looking at the big picture, how can countries like the United States, operating through the Commission, but also more broadly, deal with these new sources of threat, which, as we can see on the front page of the newspaper every day now?
Yeah. Uh, well, again, there's no point in being utopian here. We're not going to end the phenomenon of civil wars. History is not going to come to an end. To some extent, the success of the conduct of our foreign policy generally will redound to the benefit of persecuted religious minorities and individuals. So, if we do a better job of handling situations like, what happened in Sudan, what is happening in Nigeria, and then the actual outright civil wars in places like Syria and Iraq. If we do a better job, that will redound to the benefit of religious freedom. But in the meantime, I think we need to be naming, stigmatizing, doing anything we can by way of freezing assets or restricting travel for people associated with transnational organizations or other non-state actors that are violating people's basic religious freedom rights.
Yep. To that end, as you described in response to my question earlier about why it is that many recommendations for designation go ignored even though it's
Yeah.
your view that the law requires the State Department to follow the recommendation. Uh, and you described yourself as an advocate in a sort of a governmental force field in which there are many competing considerations. What can be done, what should be done to raise the visibility and the saliency of this issue within the State Department such that your advocacy can be more effective more often?
Okay, good. First, I just want to say that the law does not require the State Department to accept our recommendations, so I'm not making that argument. I am making the argument that the law requires the State Department to designate as CPCs any countries that are guilty of systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious liberty, and that's why Pakistan should be designated.
Okay.
Not because we recommend it. It's kind of like the Euthyphro, if we can go back to philosophy.
Yeah, got it.
It's like the
Okay.
Euthyphro problem.
No
It's
problem.
not because we recommend it.
Right.
It's because we recommend it because these states are
Mhm.
meeting the statutory standard, unfortunately, for
Mhm.
CPC designation. Now, sometimes our recommendations, for example, on Boko Haram, we had been recommending terrorist designation for Boko Haram for, I think, 5 or 6 years, and getting nowhere. Now, finally, Boko Haram has been designated as a terrorist organization. You have these problems in State Departments. Things will go on that should have been done, taken care of 4, 5, 6 years ago. We believe 13 years in the case of Pakistan.
Right.
And they don't happen. Now, what do? Well, there's our advocacy. Also, people who are associated, and there's some in this room, with leadership of religious groups, religious minority groups, they need to be active. Their voice needs to be heard. Pressure needs to be brought from their communities on political leaders in Congress and in the administration. This is how democracy works. Their voices should be heard. People from diaspora communities. I benefited in my work on Vietnam from the Vietnamese diaspora community here in the United States. Great source of information. These are people who are in touch with what's happening. They have their own lines of communication and to oppressed people, Buddhists and Catholics and other Christians in Vietnam, and they can be effective advocates. Go out in the public square, call the attention of your fellow citizens, especially religious believers, not exclusive, but especially religious believers, to the plight of suffering people. Think, Bill, back to Jackson Vanik, and what a great job Christians did in assisting Jews, often getting information out through the churches to support the efforts of the administration and Congress to bring pressure on the Soviets to permit the Soviet Jews to emigrate. That can be done for other groups. There's no reason why Christian churches cannot be advocates on behalf of the Baha'is, on behalf of the Ahmadi Muslims who are persecuted in places like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, in the case of Baha'is in places like Iran. It's not that Christian churches are unwilling to advocate for other religions. In the case of the Soviet Jews, it's clear that they're not. It's often that they don't know. And to the extent that we can inform them, they can become a powerful political force for the Baha'is, for the Ahmadi Muslims, for the Sufis, for others, the Rohingya.
Yep.
I mean, how many Christians today, really, honestly, how many Christians today know that there are Muslims in Burma, much less the horrible treatment that they're subjected to? Well, that should change.
Well, I know you have a hard stop at 10:30, so let me just end by, on behalf of everybody here and the country, thanking you for, as they say, your service. I find it difficult to believe that religious freedom could have a better or more committed advocate, and it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Bill.